some environmental concerns started to arise. People started to question whether or not there would be ecological impacts, risks to marine life, spreads of invasive species. There's always going to be some controversy. It was an unfortunate time in Hawaii history, but that began kind of 2004. Court cases continued to move forward, and in March of 2009, they were ordered to shut down their service. Hey, what's happening, friends? I often get asked, how come there's no boat that goes in between the islands and takes people in between the islands? How come you got to get on a plane and fly? And there's a couple of different reasons for that. And the first simple answer to that is there used to be, and I'm going to tell you about the Super Ferry and some of the history and information behind it. But one of the big reasons first that there is no regular boat service in between the islands is because it is very, very rough in between the islands. These are islands that came out of the ocean floor, and it's very, very deep in between the islands. There are winds that blow in between the islands that are channeled in between the large mountains. So for example, between the Big Island and Maui, it's one of the most treacherous channels in between two islands in the world. And so you can't just get in a little boat and roll your way across in between the two islands. You got to be in a pretty significant vessel to get in between the islands by ocean. And so that's why the state back in the early 2000s partnered with a private company called the Super Ferry and started to build a service that would do that, take passengers and vehicles in between the islands. And so the history behind that is tumultuous. There's a lot of controversy behind it. And I actually was working directly for the governor of the state of Hawaii during this period. So I had a lot of firsthand knowledge about this entire project and the process. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through and give you some of my opinions at the end about it and why it turned out the way it turned out. So just to begin, some information about the Super Ferry. These things were huge. They were like a cruise ship, and they had a capacity of about 850 to 860 passengers. So a lot of people could be on them, and approximately 200 vehicles could also be loaded onto these ferries. So they weren't little. A lot of times you see these in other coastal places where maybe you have a small ferry with 20 or 30 cars and 100 people can go on them. These were really large vessels because of the need for you to have a large vessel to go in between the islands. And the biggest benefit for these vessels was you could get a passenger and a vehicle in between the islands round trip for $200 to $300. It was less than $100 for a person and about $100 or so depending on the car. And so you could get in between the islands relatively inexpensive, even at the time, 20 years ago almost now, when this was taking place. And if you look now at the cost of shipping a vehicle in between the islands, one way, you're talking $700-800 one way. And then normally to fly in between the islands, it's usually $150 round trip. And actually airline fees were higher back then than they are today because we had less competition. But today, if you wanted to take your car to another island, it's a very long process. You have to book in advance in one of the local shipping companies. You got to drop it off the day before. You got to pick it up the day after it arrives. I mean, it can be a week-long process to get your vehicle from one island to another, where with the Super Ferry, it was one day, you just drive on and you get there. It was a while. It took 4 to 6 hours to get in between the islands, but you would get in between the islands relatively quickly. But it didn't work out. And I'm going to tell you kind of how it all went down and the timeline behind the Super Ferry and its short existence here on the island. So in the early 2000s, the planning phase began. People started talking about an inter-island ferry service. People thought it was a good idea. The state started their planning process because the state had to upgrade their ports in order to be able to dock these large boats and offload the vehicles on and off. And so there was some state investment that had to happen. Tens of millions of dollars ended up being spent to upgrade our ports and our harbors in order to receive the ferry. And then the private company actually built the vessels and brought them to Hawaii. And so this all began in the early 2000s. In about 2004, some environmental concerns started to arise. People started to question whether or not there would be ecological impacts, risks to marine life, spreads of invasive species, things like that. And so those concerns started happening. Of course, anytime anything new happens, there's always going to be some controversy, but that began kind of 2004. And the state continued to move forward. It felt like that this was going to be a good benefit to everybody in the state, and they continued to move forward with their plans to launch service. And that happened in 2007. So in 2007, after years of planning and political negotiations and all the stuff that goes into it, the Super Ferry was launched in August of 2007. And it initially started between just Oahu and Maui. That was the shortest trip. That they were going to have 2 boats, and the first boat that went into service was going between Oahu and Maui. And as soon as that started, legal challenges started to follow. So people started filing suit in court to stop it because of all of these environmental concerns that were taking place. And the main concern that people talked about was that there should have been an environmental impact study, an environmental impact statement that is required under state law when there are new construction, infrastructure improvements, things like that. The state took the position that that was unnecessary because this was just one of another boat of the many boats that go in between the islands to ship goods back and forth, and it wasn't anything different than what was already there. So it wasn't necessary to have a separate environmental impact statement done just for the Super Ferry. So the court cases continued to move forward, and then in 2008, ultimately the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that allowing the Super Ferry to operate without an environmental review was unconstitutional, and in March of 2009, they were ordered to shut down their service. So that happens, court battles continued, but then in late 2009, the Super Ferry just decided to cease operations because of the continued public opposition, and they ended up having to declare bankruptcy and then officially ceased operations. And what ended up happening, that was pretty much the end of the story at that point. The company went bankrupt. They ended up selling the vessels to the Department of Defense, and they were actually repurposed for military use. But it was a short-lived window. I personally never got to experience the Super Ferry. I never did go ride on it. I wish I did, but it's something that I think a lot of people feel like made a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people still to this day wonder why we don't have one. But going forward, it's very unlikely anybody would ever try to do this again because of the huge capital, the huge amount of money that you have to invest in order to get this whole thing going. And the fact that it was shut down so quickly by the state, is a huge risk from a business standpoint. And it'd be very hard to find another private entity that would want to do that. I'll leave you in conclusion with kind of my opinion on what happened is, if you look at it, everything is political and everything is politics. And this was an interesting case of environmentalists kind of teaming up with the existing legacy transportation apparatus that is here in the state, primarily the airlines and the shipping companies. And they teamed up to fund these lawsuits and these lawyers to get this thing stopped, because there was a huge threat to the airline industry and the current shipping industry that had a monopoly on moving people back and forth amongst the islands. And you can imagine if they're charging us $700 or $800 to move one car one way between the islands, and somebody else could do it for $100 or $150, that would have been a problem, and consumers would have made that choice. They would have had to have adjusted their operation. And same thing with the airlines. At the time, the airlines were charging upwards of $100 one way for a airline ticket, and so their business model was also threatened. So they teamed up with environmental activists who ended up getting the whole thing shut down. So it was an unfortunate time in Hawaii history. We do things like that somewhat often, unfortunately, but that is the short or the long story about why we don't have a ferry system that goes in between the islands to take people back and forth. So hope this helps your understanding of the history of the Super Ferry. If you have any questions, you can always put it in the comments below. If you have questions about anything Hawaii real estate related, you can always email me at dylan@buybigisland.com or book a meeting in the description below. There's always a link to my calendar. You can book it directly there, and we'll talk about whatever you're interested in. So that's your history of the Super Ferry. Thanks for watching, guys. Aloha.